Hi, this is Mrs. Bolin, and I'm going to be going over our notes for section 6.1. So first of all, here is the warm-up. Question number 1 says find the slope for the given information. So remember that in y equals mx plus b slope-intercept form, whatever is stuck to the x is our slope. So in this case, m would equal 4. Question number 2, if I'm going to find the slope, I want to know how far did it go up or down. In this case, it actually went down by 6. And in the x direction, I went over by 3. So the slope would be the change in y over the change in x. And if we reduce that, we get -2. Question number 3, this table is written a little bit differently. So again, we have a change in x is 2. And then the change in y was up by 5. So remember that when you're writing your slope, we always put the vertical change on the top. So it went up by 5, and then it went over by 2. So our slope for that one, 5 over 2. Question number 4. This one we can just count, and you could start at this point and go all the way up to that point. But you can also just look for the next time when the line crosses evenly through the grid right in the corner. So you could say, well, I went up by 2, right? M equals +2, and then I went over by 1. So you could write it as 2 over 1, or if you reduced it, it would just be a plain old 2. All right. So here is our information for today. We are going to be writing the equation. So for all of these things, we are able to find the slope when it was in equation form, when it was in table form, when it was in graph form. So we're going to need the slope to be able to write an equation for a certain relationship. So let's go ahead and go over some practice problems, but keep in mind, we can write linear equations using slope-intercept form. So that's what we're going to be using today for writing equations. So question number 1, write an equation of each line in slope-intercept form. Well, I can start with y equals mx plus b, and we always leave x and y in our equations as a place for inputs and outputs, but we want to replace the m and the b with the specific numbers that describe this relationship. So this one tells us that the slope is -3. Well, that goes in for m. And then it tells us the y-intercept is 1/2, so that goes in for b. And that is it. That's all the work you have to do on these. Okay, so that was the easiest situation there. Well, let's look at problem number 2. What do we know? Remember that we're going to start with y equals mx plus b every time. And the first time we knew what m and b were. This one, they tell us m, but all we know is an x value and a y value. We don't know what b is. So we're going to plug in the information that we know and try to find b. So y is equal to -1, m was equal to -2, x is equal to 3, and I need to solve it to find what b is. So sorry, I want to make sure that doesn't look like a 6. All right, so we're going to multiply here. So we have -1 equals -6 plus b. And then I'm going to add 6 to both sides. And I get b is equal to 5. Okay? And so that's not my final answer. Remember, my final answer looks like this. It has a place for an input, it has a place for an output, and then it tells us the rate of change in the start value. So I'm going to plug those in now. And so I know y equals m is still -2. And then I put the x next to it. And then I'm going to put the b at the end. So that's what I had to solve for. So that one took a little bit more work, but just plugging in the information that we know. All right, next we're going to look at a graph and see what we can find on the graph to write our equation. So remember, we're saying y equals mx plus b for every single one of these. The y is always going to stay in my equation, with the exception that if you're plugging something in to find a value, but the y will always end up in our final answer. Okay, so the m is how I move, so that's the slope. So I started here, And I crossed again evenly right there. So I need to see, well, how much did I go up by and how much did I go over by? So from here to here, I went up by 3 and over by 2. And if you started at the starting point, went to the end point, it would be up by 6 over by 4, which you would need to reduce, and you'd still get 3 over 2. So you get the same slope. Whatever point you start at, whatever point you end at, you'll always get the same slope, as long as it's along the same line. So then we're going to put the x, and then for b is the y-intercept. Well, it tells us right here, remember when x is 0, that's the y-intercept. So I'm going to put a -3 at the end, and that is my final answer. Okay, question number 4. I'm going to do that one just like this last one. So I'm going to start with y equals mx plus b. The m is my slope, how I move. Well, this one I went up by 2, over by 1. So I wrote it as a fraction, but when you're entering it in Canvas, you're going to want to make sure that you simplify it all the way. So 2 divided by 1 would just be 2. And then the b is wherever it crosses the y-axis, which is right there. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4. So it went down by 4. So I wrote a plus there, but it should actually be a -4. You could also write plus a -4, but then you would want to simplify it. I'm going to rewrite that. Y equals 2x minus 4. Okay, question number 5. Well, all we have is a couple points. So anytime you have 2 points, you can find the slope of the line. And if you guys remember from our previous chapter, the way that I find the slope is I find the rise. How far did it go up? Over how far did it go over? So the vertical change over the horizontal change. So if I'm going to find y, the equation for that would be the second y minus the first y over the second x minus the first x. You can also say from -5 to -5, how much did it go up by? Well, it went up by 0. Okay, and remember, if we're subtracting a negative, that's the same thing as adding. And then 8 minus 0 is 8. Well, if I have 0/8, I have nothing. If I cut a pizza into 8 slices and I have 0 of those slices, I have 0 pizza. And you're very sad. Okay, the other thing we want to do is we want to find b. Well, remember that the y-intercept occurs wherever x is equal to 0. And so we have that information. We know that when x is 0, y is -5. So I know m is 0. I know that y is -5, sorry, the y-intercept, which would be b. So I can write that as an equation, y equals 0x minus 5. Now, if you're going to simplify that, what that really looks like is just y equals -5. Okay. Question number 6, we're going to do the same way. There's going to be one extra step. This is our longest kind of problem because we have to find the slope and then we're going to have to plug it back in to find our y-intercept. So for this one, I'm going to start by finding the slope, and you don't have to use the formula. You can say, how far did it go up by in the y direction? If it went from 4 to 10, it went up by 6. If I went from 1 to 3 in the x direction, I went over by 2. But you can always write it out as subtraction problems if that's easier. Whatever works better for you. You could also graph it and then count up and over. That's fine too. So now that I know the slope, I'm going to pick one of these values that's a little bit easier to plug in for y equals mx plus b, and I need to find what b is. So remember, the first one is x, the second one is y. They go kind of alphabetically. So I'm going to plug it in. So y equals 4, m equals 3, x equals 1, and I need to find what b is. I'm going to do my work up here. So I have 4 equals 3 plus b minus the 3 on both sides. So b is equal to 1. Now, the final step would be to plug the b and the m into our equation. So I'm going to plug it into y equals mx plus b. I'm going to write y equals, instead of the m, I'm going to put 3. Then I write my x, and then the b I know is equal to 1. So that's the answer for question number 6. That was a long one. Question number 7 is a little bit easier, but it looks a lot more confusing. So if you look at a problem like this, you can always convert it to an ordered pair. Remember that the number here is our input or our x value, and the number that comes out is our output or our y value. So I can just easily write that as an ordered pair if that makes a little bit more sense to you. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say in the y direction from 10 to 34, it went up by 24. In the x direction from 0 to 6, it went over by 6. So my slope is 4. Okay, now remember for finding the y-intercept, that happens when the x value is 0, which we already know. So I know that b is equal to 10. So I can write my equation now, y equals mx plus b. All right, oops, sorry, that was off. Question number 8 is going to be just like question number 6 up above. We can write this as an ordered pair. My input was 4, my output was -2. My input was 8, my output was 4, or you could say x value, y value. So now we're going to start by finding the slope every single time, every single one of these problems, we start by finding the slope. Okay, so in the y direction, if I went from -2 all the way up to 4, I went up by 6 spaces. If I started at 4 and went over to 8, I went over by 4 spaces. And again, if you were to write this out, you could, on the top, you could go 4 minus -2, and on the bottom, you could go 8 minus 4. And remember, subtract a negative is plus, so you'd still wind up with 6 over 4, which we want to reduce. And so we get 3 over 2. And then we're going to plug that in to get our y-intercept, which is going to be a little bit of a challenge here. So it's up to you whether you want to use smaller numbers or you want to use all positives. I think I'm going to go for the all positives just to make things a little bit easier. But I'm going to plug that in to y equals mx plus b. Remember that this is my x, this is my y. And it doesn't matter which point you use, you'll come up with the same answer for b, I promise. So I'm going to plug in the y is 4, m is 3/2, x is 8, and then plus b. So here's my secret shortcut for multiplying by fractions. The number in the top means times, the number in the bottom means divide by. So I like to do the divide by first, and you could do it in either order, but the divide by first will make your number smaller. So if I go 8 divided by 2, the answer that I get is 4. Okay, now all I have to do is go 3 times 4, which is easy, right? So 4 is equal to 12 plus b. I'm going to move this up here. So 4 equals 12 plus b. And then I'm going to subtract the 12 on both sides. So I get -8 is equal to b. So now I can write my equation finally after all that work. So I have y is equal to 3/2 x minus 8. All right, that was really long, you guys. Now we're going to start your homework. I'm going to go over the odd solutions with you. Hopefully, based on that, you'll be able to try the evens and do your best on those. But again, here's the solutions to all of the odd numbered problems. So question number 1, now these ones are going to seem super easy because there's like no work at all in these ones. So y equals mx plus b. Remember, the slope is represented by m. The y-intercept is represented by b. So we're just going to take this value and plug it in, and that value and plug it in. So I have y equals -3/4 x minus 6. You could write it as plus a -6, but the simplest way to write it would be just -6. Okay, question number 2. We know what our slope is. We have an x value, we have a y value, but we always want to know m and b. So we have the m, but in order to find b, we're going to have to plug in the information we know. So all of these problems, we're always going to start off with y equals mx plus b once we know the slope. This one, they just tell us the slope. So I'm going to plug this in. So 5 equals m is -1, x is 3, and then plus b is what I'm trying to find. So 5 equals -3 plus b. I'm going to add 3 on both sides, so I get 8 is equal to b. Again, that's not my answer. My answer is y equals, I'm going to plug in my slope, -1, x, and then I'm going to plug in b at the end, plus 8. So this is correct, but it's not simplified. If I want to simplify it as much as I can, I would write it as negative x plus 8. Okay, question number 3. We have some information on a graph. So y equals mx plus b. I'm always going to have y equals. I need to find the m. M went down by 1. And let's see how far we went over by 1, 2, 3, 4. So down by 1, over by 4. The down, we put a negative, and then we always put the over on the bottom, right? Because if I read this, this says 1 over 4. And then we put the x right there, and then b is where it crosses the y-axis. So remember, whenever x is 0, that's the y-intercept. Okay, wherever the line crosses through the y-axis. And that happens in this case at positive 3. Okay, question number 4, same thing. Y equals mx plus b. So the m is how we move. That one's a little bit tricky because the points that they give you, it's by 2s. So you need to be careful on this one. So I'm just going to say, well, from 1 to 4, it went up by 3. And from 4 to 8, it went over by 4. So make sure that you're really careful there looking at the scale. You could also just look for a point where it goes through exactly and say, oh, it went up by 3, it went over by 4. You could do it that way also, or you could just subtract the y values and the x values. And then we're going to put an x, and then be careful on the b, because even though this looks like it's at the first box, if this third one is 6 and the fifth one is 10, that tells us that they're going by 2s, right? 2, 4, 6, 8. So this one would be at -2. And again, I shouldn't have written my plus so soon. So the correct answer would be 3/4 x minus 2. And I just realized I just did 2 even problems for you. Sorry. I'm just so excited. Just love doing math all the time. All right, question number 5. We're going to find the slope first, and I'm going to see from 7 to -15, how much did it change by? Well, it dropped by 7 and then 15 more. So altogether, it dropped by 22. And then if I went from 2 to 0, I went backwards by 2. So if I reduce that, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. 22 divided by 2 is 11. Again, if you guys want to use the formula, here's what it would look like. -15 minus 7, and then 0 minus 2. And you'll get the same thing that I got. Whatever way makes more sense to you, do it that way. Okay. And so once we have the slope, then this one we're lucky because they tell us the value when x equals 0. We know what y is. So that's going to be b, our y-intercept. So y equals 11x minus 15 is the equation. All right, you're going to do this one on your own. This one's a little bit tricky. You're going to have to start by finding the slope, and then you're going to have to pick one of those points to plug in for x and y, and then you're going to solve for b, and then write it like this. All right, question number 7. Remember, we can write these as an ordered pair. This way of notation just means that's my input when I plug it into the function, and here's what comes out. So again, that just represents our x and our y values. So we're going to use that to find the slope. So the change in y, I went from 7, but I went all the way down to 1, so I dropped by 6. And then if I'm in the x direction, I went from 0 to 3, I went over by 3. So my slope would be -2. This one, again, we got lucky because they told us when x is 0, what y is equal to, and I know that that's my y-intercept, b. So I can just write this as y equals -2x plus 7. For this next one, you're actually going to have to solve, plug in for x and y, and find it. All right, question number 9 says, describe and correct the error in writing the equation. Well, if the slope is 2, that would be y equals 2x plus 7. What happened here? What did they do? I bet you guys could figure it out without me even saying it, but they switched it. They put them in the wrong place. So make sure that you correct it like I did, but make sure you also write a sentence to describe what they did wrong. All right, same thing with number 10. See if you could figure out what went wrong here. Think about this line is going down as we look at it from left to right. So I know that when a line goes down, that is a negative slope. So you can maybe fix this problem here and describe what happened. And that is it for your 6.1 notes.